Okay, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Robert Stern, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Sheffield. He's published widely on German idealism, Kierkegaard, Luxdorf, and more recently Martin Luther. His publications include Hegelian metaphysics, understanding moral obligation, Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Kantian ethics, and the radical demand in Luxdorf's ethics. He was elected as a fellow of the British Academy in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Robert Stern.
Hi, thank you, everybody. And I should apologize in advance. I have a mild case of COVID, so if I'm a little bit more subdued than normal, apologies, but I think I'll be fine. But a bit croaky, it seems. Thank you very much, Ahmed. It's great to see you, if only virtually. Ahmed and I go back a long way. He was one of my PhD supervisors who taught me more about MacIntyre than I ever taught him, I'm sure. Thank you also to the other organizers for this great conference. Good, so I think there is a handout that you should be able to download from the chat. It's just got some quotes and basic structure, and I'll sort of, in effect, read through the paper if that's all right, but look forward to questions. So I'll just get the paper up. So yeah, this talk is a little bit traumatic for me because I think it's only maybe the second time I've actually criticized Hegel in a presentation or paper. So in a way, it's a win-win because either you agree with me that my criticism is a good one, in which case that's fine, or you convince me I'm wrong, in which case Hegel's right, and that's also fine. So I can't really lose with this talk. But what I'm talking about is Hegel and MacIntyre as what I'm going to be, or what is sometimes known as post-Kantian perfectionists of different kinds. And then the question is going to arise which we should prefer. And I'm going to consider an argument in favor, actually, of MacIntyre by appealing to the film Paris, Texas. So that's roughly what I'm doing. And the structure will be, I'll just say what I mean by post-Kantian perfectionism and why we should maybe consider Hegel and MacIntyre in these terms. I'm then going to look at how Hegel and MacIntyre differ, I think, and consider an argument to prefer MacIntyre over Hegel, and then consider some responses to that argument. So first of all, what do I mean by calling them post-Kantian perfectionists? Well, perfectionism, as we all know, has its roots in Aristotelianism and is outlined, I think, helpfully by Terry Irwin in the first quote on the handout. Aristotle defends an account of the human good as happiness, eudaimonia, consisting in the fulfillment of human nature, expressed in the various human virtues. His position is teleological, insofar as it seeks the best guide for action in an ultimate end. Eudaimonist, insofar as it identifies the ultimate end with happiness. And naturalist, insofar as it identifies virtue and happiness in a life that fulfills the nature and capacities of rational human nature. Now, there were various forms of perfectionism dominant before Kant, but Kant subjects the position to a critique on a number of grounds, claiming, for example, it's heteronymous because it aims at the satisfaction of desires. It collapses morality into a system of merely hypothetical imperatives. It makes morality empirical rather than a priori. It puts the good prior to the right, and somewhat ironically, given the criticisms of Kant, that it's unable to provide any contentful guidance on how we should act. But of course, Kant's own position has its problems, so the perfectionist option has never really gone away, I think, but it's been developed in different ways under the influence of Kant's critique, hence the idea of what Doug Mogat calls post-Kantian perfectionism, which takes on, in some sense, the Kantian challenge. Now, I think among other philosophers, it's helpful to see Hegel and MacIntyre in this light, namely as, in some sense, returning to the classical perfectionist tradition of Aristotle, but against the background of the turn taken by Kant, to which they respond in various ways. Okay, so now to bring out how they differ as perfectionists. As we already heard from Michael's helpful introduction, MacIntyre draws on Hegel in extensive ways, but on the other hand, he doesn't get a lot of explicit or extensive discussion. I think he's only discussed at length in the article, as Michael mentioned, Hegel on Faces and Skulls, and the chapter Hegel and Marx in a Short History of Ethics. But as Michael was saying, it's obvious that Hegel is an influence on MacIntyre in various ways, in terms of his method, his conception of the contrast between ancient and modern, the dialectic of individualism and communitarianism, the focus on history, and so on. So, nonetheless, while expressing appreciation, MacIntyre is often also critical of Hegel, as in some sense too much of an absolute idealist, namely as believing in some attainable final standpoint, an end of history, and so on. So just to give you one quote, I think there are others on the handout. The first one, I am irremediably anti-Hegelian, rejecting the notion of an absolute standpoint independent of the particularity of all traditions. And there's some other quotes on the handout. Now, I think as an Hegelian reading what MacIntyre says here, and these sorts of criticisms of Hegel, I think there's a sense of that you might feel that that's not a particularly interesting critique in some respects, because after all, many people have had this sort of worry about Hegel's absolute, and it doesn't therefore make MacIntyre's concern very distinctive. But also, I mean, Hegelians are likely to think this is based on a rather old-fashioned view of Hegel's conception of the absolute. There's more to be said. So, of course, that doesn't mean to say what MacIntyre says here is wrong, but there's plenty of room for debate. And as I say, some of this criticism just may seem overly familiar. But what I want to suggest today is perhaps there are interesting differences between Hegel and MacIntyre that can be found elsewhere, even if these aren't the ones highlighted by MacIntyre himself. And that's the option I'm going to explore, focusing on their differing conceptions of the human good or flourishing, which again is what I think makes them different kinds of post-Kantian perfectionists, and also why they, I think, therefore give different accounts of the virtues. Now, I'm only going to be focusing on the MacIntyre of after virtue up to that point. I think the story changes significantly in the later MacIntyre, particularly when we get to dependent rational animals. So I'm not going into that period of MacIntyre. So if we're taking them to be post-Kantian perfectionists of a different kind, how do their conceptions of the good life differ? Well, to put it in slogan form, taking the first slogan from MacIntyre himself, in his view, the good life for man is the life spent seeking for the good life for man. And so if we want a sort of corresponding slogan for Hegel to bring out the difference, I think we could say the good life for man is the life spent living in the rational state. So I'm going to briefly consider the arguments for each of these positions to bring out the differences I have in mind. So first of all, again, very briefly, MacIntyre, as you all know, he thinks that unlike orthodox Aristotelianism, we can't run our conception of the good off our metaphysical biology. But the human self and agency function within a narrative structure, which must have a certain order and coherence, which comes from a quest for the good. And what the goal of this quest is cannot be understood in advance of the quest, as he puts it, as miners search for gold or geologists for oil, where you know what you're looking for, you just got to find it. Instead, MacIntyre says, quote, it is in the course of the quest and only through encountering and coping with the various particular harms, dangers, temptations, and distractions, which provide any quest with its episodes and incidents, that the goal of the quest is finally to be understood. A quest is always an education, both as to the character of that which is to be sought and in self-knowledge, end quote. And then the virtues are what we require in order to, as he puts it, sustain us in the relevant kind of quest for the good, by enabling us to overcome the harms, dangers, temptations, and distractions which we encounter, and which will furnish us with increasing self-knowledge and increasing knowledge of the good, end quote. And then finally, this quest is not just one we can pursue individually, but which requires others and also traditions of which we are part. And various virtues may also be needed here too. So MacIntyre says lack of justice, lack of truthfulness, lack of courage, lack of the relevant intellectual virtues. These corrupt traditions, just as they do those institutions and practices which derive their life from the traditions of which they are contemporary embodiments. So based on his arguments that the good life for human beings consists in the quest to find the good life for human beings, MacIntyre constructs a certain conception of the virtues required, even while rejecting Aristotle's metaphysical biology. Okay, so that's a brief, very brief summary of MacIntyre. Now to move on to Hegel equally briefly. So I suggested a summary of Hegel's position above. The good life for man is the life spent living in the rational state. Of course, that's a bit of a crude simplification, as there's more to Hegel's conception of the good life than just life in the state. It also includes art, religion, philosophy, for example, though these are also all arguably in the end bound up with that life. But still, it might be more accurate to say the good life for man is to a significant degree the life spent living in the rational state. So why does Hegel think this, and what does he mean by it? Well, I think it fundamentally goes back to his account of the freedom of the will in the introduction to the philosophy of right. In my view, rather than base his perfectionism on Aristotelian biologism, Hegel bases it on his conception of what it takes for us to achieve a will that is free, which is a fundamental feature of what it takes to be a properly functioning person. Hegel conceives of the will in terms of his three fundamental categories from the logic of universal, particular, and individual, and sets out in paragraphs 5 to 7 of the introduction, as set out in paragraphs 5 to 7 of the introduction to the philosophy of right. So let me just consider each in turn briefly, beginning with universality. So Hegel says here, quote, the will contains A, the element of pure indeterminacy, or of the eye's pure reflection of itself into itself, in which every limitation, every content, whether present immediately through nature, through needs, desires, and drives, or given and determined in some other way, is dissolved. This is the limitless infinity of absolute abstraction or universality, the pure thinking of oneself. Well, what is Hegel getting at there? I think he's getting at the idea that the universal aspect of the will consists in our ability to abstract from all content and determination as a kind of pure I, a sort of stepping back of the self from all content. He then sets out the other moment of particularity more briefly, where he says, B, in the same way, I is the transition from undifferentiated indeterminacy to differentiation, determination, and the positing of a determinacy as a content and object. So the second aspect of particularization consists in the determination or limiting of the will to specific goals or projects. Now, on their own, Hegel argues each of these moments of the will is unsatisfactory. The purely universal moment leads to an empty indeterminacy, as the will cannot act unless it resolves on something particular. You can't, as it were, will in general. You have to do something. And this is where Hegel refers to his conception of Hindu mysticism, but also the intolerance to everything particular, as he puts it, which fueled the terror in the French Revolution. There was no, as it were, content that the self, the universal self, could sustain or accept, and therefore everything was constantly destroyed. So the purely universal is unsatisfactory, but equally the merely particular can be equally unsatisfactory because it can seem empty and arbitrary, as the will can always step back and abandon all its goals by taking up the more universal standpoint. So we have a sort of familiar dialectical back and forth. And to resolve it, we need a third moment that brings these sides together, which Hegel calls individuality in paragraph 7. So see, the will is the unity of both these moments, particularity reflected into itself, and thereby restored to universality. So I think what Hegel's getting at is what we need to resolve this impasse is some kind of particularity to the self, because you've got to do something in particular, but one which, from a more universal standpoint, can also be endorsed or seen as meaningfully, fundamentally meaningful, rather than as empty and arbitrary. This then is the third moment of the will as a satisfactory unity of the other two, namely individuality as the coming together of universality and particularity. Now, how is this to be achieved? Well, it's to be achieved in the rational state, because through fulfilling their own particular ends and roles, the individual can also contribute to the good of all and thus to the universal, and vice versa. Thus, it is only through the social world that it is possible for the tensions within the will to be resolved, and empty universality transmuted into a genuinely coherent account of action. The citizen of the rational state can see their life as particularized in various ways. You're a lecturer, a father, a husband, and so on. But if that life has a place within a wider whole with a more universal value, then they can also see these particular elements as not arbitrary restrictions and limitations, but instead can come to reflectively endorse this particularity by seeing it as related to the universal social good of which lives of this sort are part, which can include some space for merely private interests. In this way, Hegel thinks a kind of abstract universalism can be avoided, whereas instead, each of us has a determinate part to play, that in the light of their abilities and interests, but where those abilities and interests are not merely particular, given their contribution to the social whole and the space that the modern state leaves for such interests. So I think actually the British idealist Bradley puts this sort of basic Hegelian thought rather well in slightly different terminology. I am to be perfectly homogeneous. I think that's what Bradley's version of universality. But that I cannot be unless fully specified, so particularized. And the question is, how can I be extended so as to take in my external relations? Goethe has said, be a whole or join a whole. But to that we must answer, you cannot be a whole unless you join a whole. So it's by being part of the rational state that this unity of universality and particularity in the individual is achieved. So Hegel's political philosophy is then his account of what form such a state might take, in which the human will can be properly realized in these three dimensions or moments in a way that makes human flourishing possible. Where by talking of the state, I don't just mean the political state outlined in section 3 of the philosophy of right, but also the other components of ethical life, such as the family and civil society, which I think ultimately Hegel takes to be integrated within it. Now, it's worth noting briefly that MacIntyre himself doesn't really, as it were, approach Hegel's political philosophy in this way. I think for MacIntyre, what is of interest in Hegel is what he sees as an attempt to revive the classical polis, which will embed the individual sufficiently in the community, such that the good will no longer be a matter of individual choice. But then for MacIntyre, the problem is, quote, what for modern man can take the place of the polis? It is in his answer to this question that Hegel is least convincing. But I don't think Hegel really is grappling with MacIntyre's problem of how to avoid value becoming a matter of choice. So I think the rational state is meant to operate in a different way, namely to resolve the tension between empty universality and arbitrary particularity that I've been discussing. So again, instead of adopting MacIntyre's own critique of Hegel, I want to consider how MacIntyre could argue against Hegel on the basis of their competing conceptions of the good life. Namely that for Hegel, as we've seen, the good life is something that has been found. We know what it is, what it needs to consist in, and it just requires realization in a suitable state. While for MacIntyre, it is something to be sought, so that the Hegelian state and the virtues that go with it are given the wrong grounding. Okay, so now moving on to section 3 of this paper, I'm going to consider an argument for MacIntyre's position based on Wim Wenders' film, Paris, Texas. And this argument has been inspired by reading a paper forthcoming in Angelici by my colleague Chris Bennett called Love Among the Ruins, on the possibility of dialectical activity in Paris, Texas. Now, ironically, perhaps, the notion of dialectical activity, which I'm going to be using to criticize Hegel, is, of course, somewhat inspired by Hegel, but has been developed by Talbot Brewer. And according to Brewer, a dialectical activity is, quote, an activity whose value cannot be grasped with perfect lucidity from the outset, but must be progressively clarified via engagement in the activity itself, and where each successive engagement yields a further stretch of understanding of the goods internal to the activity, hence of what count as proper engagement in it. So as an example of what I think they have in mind, you don't enter into a relationship with someone, or say a romantic relationship with someone, with a full sense of the good to be achieved thereby. You know, we're like the miner searching for gold. We're out there to just achieve certain ends of, you know, the house, the kids, the car, etc. But instead, a proper conception of the relationship is to see as central to it discovering the good through the development of the relationship itself in what may be an ongoing process with no final conclusion. And this obviously resembles MacIntyre's conception of the quest, where MacIntyre is an influence on Brewer's thinking here. So now it can be argued that one fundamental difference between MacIntyre and Hegel, I think, is this. MacIntyre sees our relation to the good human life as something we must seek or quest for, where this in itself is an important aspect of what makes it good. Whereas Hegel thinks we already know what the good human life consists in, the structure of universal, particular, and individual I've been discussing, where all we have to do is to find a way to implement it or bring it about by bringing the rational state into existence. I mean, I say all there as if it's easy. I don't think it's easy in a practical sense, but it's, as it were, conceptually easy. We know what we're trying to bring about because we have a determinate conception of the good. And then MacIntyre's criticism can be put as follows. The problem with Hegel is not that his conception of the good life for human beings is wrong as such and should thus be replaced by a better one, but that he treats it as something already known, which undermines its goodness, because we can only properly exemplify the virtues if we relate to the human good as a subject of dialectical activity or a quest, and thus not as something known that then has to be implemented or brought about. So inspired by Bennett's paper, I'm now briefly going to suggest that this problem can be illustrated through Wim Wenders' film, Paris, Texas, and particularly by the characters of Travis and Walt in that film. Now, as I'm sure you all know, and apologies for plot spoilers if you don't, the film begins with Travis appearing on screen as a mysterious and thoroughly disorientated character, but who through the course of the film starts to go on a journey of discovery about his life and relationships, which gradually lead him to find some sense of purpose or direction, climaxing in a series of actions that remain open-ended, but nonetheless seemingly progressive in leading him into a better life. Bennett summarizes Travis as follows. Travis is unbending. He is driven by something. There is something in him that needs to be worked out, and he can't stop until he has worked it out, even though he doesn't know what it is or what it requires of him. He is prepared to go into the unknown in order to be true to the thing that is within him. He is capable of getting into real problems because of the thing he is driven by. So as Bennett presents him then, Travis is engaged in seeking for the good life, and thus is engaged in a MacIntyrean quest or one of Brewer's dialectical activities. He has some intimation of where the good lies, but he only comes to see it to the extent he does through a process of ongoing articulation, which may or may not come to an end. Now, because this is the structure of Travis's relation to the good, as Bennett emphasizes, This means we can see in Travis certain key virtues, which is what leads us to admire him despite his rather obvious flaws. Bennett identifies two of those virtues as absorption, as a kind of attentiveness and focus, and fidelity, as remaining true to the demands of the situation, which Bennett argues comes with the nature of this being a dialectical activity. And as we saw previously, MacIntyre had also suggested, though not listed, that some virtues might be needed to overcome the problems and temptations we encounter in any quest. The idea then is that only in the agent who is engaged in seeking the good will certain key virtues truly be found, and that these virtues may not be needed in an agent who has found it. Such an agent, arguably, is Walt, who is Travis's brother and who in some sense rescues Travis, though to be truly saved, Travis needs to escape him. While a thoroughly decent person in many respects, Walt is clearly shown to be less admirable than Travis. As Bennett puts it, Walt has adapted well to the social world, but at the price of becoming a conformist, whose firmest motivations stem from a sense of rectitude. If we consider the character of Walt by contrast to Travis, we can say that one of the things that marks him out is his lack of these virtues and a lack of susceptibility for dialectical activity. Walt is a conformist. He has become successful because he is prepared to do what is needed, even if this means devoting his life to advertising billboards. Walt has a sense of rectitude, but no imagination. He doesn't wonder about things or ask himself difficult questions. Walt has none of the moral imagination that would be necessary for dialectical activity, for finding one's own way through an issue that grips and consumes one. Thus, drawing on this contrast between Travis and Walt, we might say that while the latter certainly has some virtues, Travis has deeper ones, and that this is not accidentally connected to the questing nature of Travis's life and the conformist nature of Walt's. Walt is a respectable citizen in what he takes to be a well-ordered social world, which thus calls on him to display no more than the rectitude required to play his part in that world. Whereas Travis is engaged in a quest for the good life, for which very different virtues are required. Moreover, beyond losing virtues in a strict sense, without this questing structure, Walt arguably also loses certain broader experiences and events that are fundamental to a good life, such as the experience of hopeful anticipation, the distinctive sort of pleasure that accompanies solving a problem, or finally seeing through a conceptual confusion, or the satisfaction that comes from viewing one's own narrative as one of growth or maturation. And it is, I think, Travis that represents the MacIntyrean model of the good life as a life spent in seeking that life, while Walt arguably represents the Hegelian one. Thus, to the extent that the film is right to suggest that Travis, for all his faults, is a better model of the good person than Walt for all his virtues, this would seem to show the MacIntyrean position is the one we should prefer. Okay, now finally on to the fourth section, where I want to consider briefly 4 responses that Hegelian might make to the critique as I've outlined it here, just to summarize the responses I'm going to discuss. First of all, might say that the MacIntyrean critique underestimates the dynamism of Hegel's own position, so there is more room for rapprochement with MacIntyre's quest model than I've suggested. Secondly, might say that the MacIntyrean critique underestimates the role that virtues have in Hegel's rational state. Thirdly, the critique is wrong to be so critical of the Hegelian model of the virtuous agent. In fact, maybe we need to be more like Travis in our world, which is not a rational state, but if we did live in the properly rational state, Walt's life would be fine. And finally, criticisms of MacIntyre's own position as being problematic and unstable. So let me start with the first reply, a sort of rapprochement strategy. The point of this response might be to emphasize what I've already noted, namely that aspects of Hegel's thinking are actually close in many ways to themes I focused on from the MacIntyrean side, such as dialectical activity. And in general, there is obviously a kind of dynamism in much of Hegel's thinking. For example, in phenomenology, spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. So might Hegel not be closer to the quest model than I have allowed? However, while I agree that a lot of Hegel's thinking is dynamic in various ways, which is partly, again, what makes the comparison with MacIntyre intriguing, I'm not sure that he is as open-ended about his conception of the free will as set out in paragraphs 5 to 7 of the Philosophy of Right, which I think then is fundamental to his conception of the good. And I also think the aim of the text, the Philosophy of Right, is to construct a state which, as much as possible, within certain contingencies, will realize that good. So this is where the categories of the logic seem to play a crucial role, and so place limits on the kind of structures that the real philosophy can take. There still leaves room for various forms of indeterminacy and open-endedness, but I think on Hegel's account, this doesn't include an open-endedness about the human good. So the aim is still to construct the state which best realizes this good, in which only the virtue of rectitude would then be required. Or put another way, if Hegel's comments about the restlessness of spirit are really meant to encompass his views of the human good, then his conception of the virtues needs to be expanded in a MacIntyrean manner. And that then leads us to the second objection to the MacIntyrean critique about the virtues and the rational state. According to this second response, the objection would be that to treat Walt as representing the Hegelian virtuous agent is one-sided and a caricature, as there is room for other virtues in Hegel's rational state. In this way, my mistake might be said to resemble Kierkegaard's rather similar-looking attack on Hegelianism with his figure of Judge or Assessor William in Either Or, who is meant to represent the Hegelian ethical stage. But of course, people respond, isn't Judge William just a caricature? It's not clear he represents Hegel's ideal of ethical life. And couldn't you or someone say in a similar spirit that it's not clear that Walt represents Hegel's ideal of virtue? Now, I think there might be some truth in this worry when it comes to Judge William, who is certainly a less appealing character than Walt. But I think it still has some force when it comes to Hegel on the virtues. Though Bennett doesn't actually mention Hegel when he singles out Walt's virtue as rectitude, this is indeed the key and virtually only virtue mentioned by Hegel in the Philosophy of Right, as what is required of someone living within the ethical community. The only other virtue seems to be valor, which is just needed when you have to defend the ethical community. So Hegel says, in an ethical community, it is easy to say what someone must do and what the duties are which he has to fulfill in order to be virtuous. He must simply do what is prescribed, expressly stated, and known to him within his situation. Rectitude is the universal quality which can be required of him, partly by right and partly by ethics. And this comes within a section that is suspicious of the notion of the virtues in general, suggesting that virtue talk can easily become, quote, empty declaration, and it goes on, only really has a place in those rare cases when duties come into collision, making the need for virtues rare in a civilized community, even though, and you can tell Hegel's being critical here, even though they may be admired by the French, who fall for the kind of individuality or virtuosity they seem to involve. So the French might go in for virtue talk, but the good German only needs rectitude. So in that sense, there seems to be sufficient textual support for the MacIntyrean critique. Namely, again, in the properly ordered Hegelian state, there isn't going to be a need for any other virtues than rectitude. And that suggests that the structure of that state is to realize the good, and then only rectitude will be required. Still, it might be said, despite this textual evidence, perhaps Hegel himself goes too far here in focusing only on rectitude as the virtue of the Hegelian citizen. After all, even in the kind of role ethics Hegel's putting forward here, not everything will be so clear and determinate that all need for further inquiry and elaboration are excluded, and thus further virtues will surely be required. For example, I may be a father, which comes with various duties, but how precisely to carry them out and what it really takes to be a good father may require much more of me than mere rectitude, but also courage, hope, and so on. Just as Walt's situation as a brother to Travis requires more than just following certain predetermined duties. Now, I think this response might indeed bring the Hegelian and MacIntyrean positions somewhat closer together, and perhaps if Hegel had been less suspicious of virtue talk for other reasons, he might have explored this option further. But still, perhaps a difference remains in that even if Hegel were forced to allow that social duties will still inevitably leave room for some element of discovery on the part of the ethical agent, he seems to be committed to thinking of this as a bug, not a feature, in a way that MacIntyre need not. So this then brings us to the third Hegelian response that I want to discuss. And this response to the critique might be to say that while the sorts of virtues Travis displays may certainly be needed in the world in which he and Walt live, this is far from a rational state, being the world of late capitalist America. But if they lived in something more resembling the kind of state Hegel has in mind, then living like Walt would be fine. Now, of course, one reply might be that there could not be such a rational state, or even if they could, it would have various problematic features, such as being insufficiently liberal and so on. But leaving such issues aside, there is perhaps a deeper question, namely, even if it could be achieved, and even if it was unproblematic in other ways, would such a state come at a loss for those living in it, precisely because the virtues required by Travis would not be needed, and so would be out of place? This is not the same as the tired old objection to Hegel as authoritarian and so on, or that he's living in the fantasy of an end of history, but raises perhaps deeper concerns about the good life as somehow requiring the kind of element of quest and uncertainty that he seems to lose. But finally, I want to consider a different Hegelian response to this critique, which again focuses as a critique of MacIntyre himself, and particularly this idea that the good life could consist in this kind of quest. And to do so, I'm going to make use of some very helpful, insightful comments made by Robert Pippin in his article, Alasdair MacIntyre's Modernity. So the final bit of this discussion is MacIntyre's own position itself tenable? And Pippin's central claim in that article is that MacIntyre gets into difficulties because he is, quote, a half-hearted Hegelian. And to avoid these difficulties, he has to become more Hegelian, not less, and so go all in with Hegel. There are various dimensions to this claim, which can't all be discussed here. But one is that MacIntyre's model of the good life that we've been focusing on, namely that the good life for man is a life spent in seeking for the good life for man, is problematic in the following way. And this is a quote on the handout again. If MacIntyre is right, and Aristotle's own account of the basis for any possibility of answering such a question, the species form of man or metaphysical biology, then why should anyone commit to seeking the good life for man? It would seem Sisyphean. What basis or what suggestion of a probable basis is there in MacIntyre for expecting any principled resolution of the disagreements between those who believe that pious devotion is the revealed world of God, and those who believe in endless experimentation with kinds of life, and those who believe in endless philosophizing about the good life for man amount to the good life for man? Why should we expect that any such notion of the human telos would be anything other than another confirmation of the incommensurable profusion of candidates that MacIntyre himself has presupposed? So there's no point, as it were, trying to replace Hegel with MacIntyre, because MacIntyre's own position, without more Hegelian elements, is in trouble. So Pippin, I think, is making two connected criticisms here. First of all, what might be called the no resolution objection. Why think MacIntyre's conception of the good life would bring to the end the ongoing debates about the good life? And secondly, the Sisyphus objection. Why embark on a quest that appears endless and hence pointless? Now, in response to the first criticism, Pippin notes that MacIntyre goes on to suggest that one conception might rationally surpass another if it is rationally superior to a concrete prior alternative. But Pippin argues this requires something more like a Hegelian philosophy of history than MacIntyre provides. Now, I'm not sure I'm convinced by this entirely, and perhaps a thinner Hegelian idea of immanent critique might be enough to give MacIntyre what he needs here, namely a way of showing that other conceptions of the good turn out to be insupportable in the way MacIntyre suggests. And then perhaps MacIntyre's account can vindicate itself by showing it is not vulnerable to the same issues, precisely because it is a theory of the good that takes into account how the good is an open-ended and contestable issue, and so makes a virtue, pun sort of intended, of what is a weakness of the other positions, for which such contestation is a sign of failure. But then I think Pippin might rightly reply that this just raises his second objection. Is MacIntyre's own position coherent, as isn't it just Sisyphean? Why would anyone embark on or take seriously MacIntyre's search for the good and thus seek to cultivate the various virtues required for this search, unless they had some reasonable expectation that it could be brought to a satisfactory conclusion? Wouldn't this be like volunteering to be Sisyphus, in volunteering to keep pushing the boulder up the hill, when in fact, of course, in the myth, this is correctly portrayed as a punishment no one would intelligibly want, and is a byword for an empty and meaningless life, not a good one. Now, I can see that this is an interesting and pressing worry to raise against MacIntyre's model, and I just want to conclude by offering a few brief thoughts in reply. First of all, I think MacIntyre's conception would be genuinely puzzling if the search was supposed to begin with us having no conception of the good. But I take it that it is a feature of Breuer's dialectical activities that one has some conception or intimation of what one is seeking to articulate, just not a determinate or final one. Whereas Sisyphus is condemned to do something pointless, and it is indeed hard to see why one would volunteer to do that. Moreover, since Travis does have an intimation of this sort, Travis has another motivation that Sisyphus lacks, namely curiosity or wonder. There is no mystery for Sisyphus. The goal is clear: get the rock to the top, watch it fall, repeat. He cannot experience curiosity or wonder, and so cannot be drawn onwards in the way a seeker of an elusive or mysterious good can. And thanks to Matt Congdon, who I think is here for discussing that point with me. Secondly, I think MacIntyre's position would also be genuinely puzzling if the search had no way of assessing whether it was making progress. And then the claim might be, how can we assess this progress unless we know what the good is? But again, I think MacIntyre's reply to this might be that some conception of internal critique could give us a sense of progress here, or what Charles Taylor in a Ragey context calls reasoning in transitions. But third, Pippin might say that his basic worry is something else, namely, why would we undertake a potentially endless quest, even if we knew roughly what direction that quest would take and what might count as progress? Isn't it the endlessness that is the problem? Here, however, MacIntyre might perhaps reply, this isn't in fact a problem, as once one sees that being on a quest is fundamental to the good life, then endlessness again becomes a feature, not a bug. Finally, however, it might be said that this reply brings out that MacIntyre's position is in fact self-undermining. On the one hand, it says that good life consists in seeking the good life, but on the other hand, it thereby tells us what the good life is, namely seeking the good life. Isn't this incoherent? Now, there certainly may be an error paradox here, but I think it can be resolved by saying inquiry into the good has uncovered that this good is dialectical, not just in Breuer's sense, that it is, as he says, an activity whose value cannot be grasped with perfect lucidity from the outset, which I think makes it sound too epistemic, as if the value can be grasped in a final way, just takes some effort to get there. But it's also an activity whose good cannot be attained unless it takes the form of the activity of continuing to grasp that good, thus resembling a relationship that is only successful if those in that relationship continue to strive to develop the goods that can be realized in it, making this what might be called a dynamic good, which requires ongoing further articulation to be realized as a good. By contrast, if the participants view the relationship as completed when certain goals have been attained, the house, the kids, the car, then it will lose its nature as a good. So then perhaps this dilemma only bites if, having discovered MacIntyre's conception of the good life, one would therefore stop living the good life as he understands it to be, namely give up the quest. But if he is right that the good life consists in questing for it, it seems plausible to think that one is more rather than less motivated to engage in that quest, just as when one discovers that the point of the journey is not to arrive, but to journey, as this is where the good of journeying resides. So perhaps the Sisyphus challenge can be disarmed. Okay, so just to sum up what I think I've tried to do, I've offered a critique of Hegel that builds on material from MacIntyre, though I think it goes beyond MacIntyre's own explicit criticisms of Hegel. And I've suggested ways in which that critique might respond to objections. I've also mentioned some ways in which I think Hegel's position could be developed in a way that brings it closer to MacIntyre's, as in fact some of the ideas involved in that critique are rather Hegelian, such as dialectical activity. But I think that when it comes to his conception of the good life and the virtues, this is still to go beyond Hegel's own position on these issues. So the critique has some purchase on Hegel himself. At the very least, I think he would have to change his account of the virtues and add to them more than just rectitude if he were to take this more MacIntyrean turn. Great, thank you very much for listening to all that.
Okay, we'll start with questions, and I think we've mentioned before we'll begin questions with our speakers. So, okay, the Robert Pippin.
Thank you. Hi, Bob. Good
Hi.
to see you, and I hope you get better soon.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was terrific. I just wanted to ask you two brief questions. One is, suppose we take let's say the Hegelian problem with MacIntyre, not so much to be Sisyphean, but inflected in a different way. I mean, if one compares the substantive position in MacIntyre with the extraordinary detail of Hegel's position in the philosophy of right, property rights, contractual obligations, a certain sense of moral rectitude, the nuclear family, corporations, estates, the Polizei, the particular version of the constitutional monarchy that he defends or something, and then compares it to MacIntyre. What if the problem with MacIntyre's perfectionism is not so much that it's Sisyphean, but that it's so insubstantial? I mean, if you compare it to Aristotle, who has a very similar position that the good life, putting aside the question of intellectual virtue for a minute, the good life for man is deliberation in common about the common good. Even Aristotle thinks that comes necessarily with certain substantive commitments, mixed regime, alternating rule, restrictions on participation, whatever one thinks of it, he's committed to a kind of substantive form of life. And that what seems to be what would be Hegel's major concern with MacIntyre is just sort of the indeterminacy of this perfectionism. It's not kind of clear what social world would be necessary in order to incorporate, given the very useful qualifications you have on why the good life for man is not just endless experimentation with various, from white nationalism to a much more virtuous kind of conception of the political whole, that MacIntyre's position is not substantively perfectionist enough. That it really doesn't tell us much about how to live when it looks like we're cooperating collective way. The other thing is more about the point you made about dynamism in Hegel. I mean, obviously, Hegel believes that the good life is life in the rational state, quite right about that. But what is the rational state? I mean, this rational state Hegel commits himself to in the philosophy of right involves a number of, from this point of view, very archaic institutions. An early version of market capitalism, small merchant, small farm. I mean, he could see what was coming, but in the English Reform Bill, he takes a very conservative, a kind of hopeless position of putting his finger in the dike, that we can't have what the English Reform Bill wants us to have, because, his objection to the beginnings of a kind of industrial architecture, the necessity to preserve small farms. Well, all of that's, I mean, from the contemporary standpoint, and very quickly after 1830, irrelevant. There is no such form of life anymore. So taking one's bearings from the owl of Minerva takes flight only at dusk, and philosophy is its own time conceived in thought. We need a rethinking, a dynamical rethinking based on internal critique of how there might be traces of a possible ethical life in the late modern global capitalist world. I'm not sure we can do that with various Hegelian commitments, but it would be a way of saying Hegel is not committed to a kind of static concept, at least if his position is at all plausible, and if consistent with these other more dynamical positions he has, if we don't try to think Hegelianly rather than just defend the philosophy of right.
Good, thanks, Robert. Yeah, so good question. So on the first one, I mean, actually, Ahmed's thesis was largely about the sort of why isn't there a political philosophy in MacIntyre? So again, it's nice that you brought it back to where all this started for us. And I think in a way, I was sort of had that question in mind doing this paper. So one answer to your question, why isn't there something more substantive by way of sort of, if you like, political, social life in MacIntyre's account? I mean, one answer is it's just accidental. I mean, one could take a MacIntyrean position and for whatever reason, he doesn't do it very much, but one could develop it. And I guess that's what various contemporary MacIntyreans, in a sense, see themselves doing. But in a way, I suppose what I was suggesting is that it's more inherent than that, because if you really take the good life to be about searching for the good life for man, you're not going to get a kind of blueprint for the good life around which you can construct a state. Now, then the question is, does that really mean that nothing substantive could be said? And I don't think that is true, because I guess this searching for the good life also brings with it, if you like, certain social institutional requirements in some sense. So I think more can be said or could be said by the MacIntyrean about it. I mean, again, in a way, Paris, Texas, the film is helpful in that regard. If we are going to think about the world more from Travis's point of view than Walt's, what kind of world do we want to construct around that? So I don't know. Is it just, as it were, accidental that MacIntyre doesn't present a more substantive position, just as it were a matter of temperament, or is it more inbuilt to the very position itself? And I think to some extent it is, because of this sort of dynamism. But then I think it still might be possible to say something more substantive than MacIntyre does about what kind of world that needs to be, the one in which the good life is seen as a kind of dynamic good. But I leave that, as it were, for MacIntyrean political philosophers to go away and think about, if they think I'm on the right track at all. But at least it makes the lack of substantiveness, in a sense, more interesting than it might be. On the second point, isn't there room for dynamism in Hegel at various levels as well? I mean, particularly if you take out of Minerva. So, yes, he's presenting the rational state as he thinks it might or ought to be, given what he knows, but that, after all, isn't very much. And so we can reframe that and change it. But I don't think that, from MacIntyre's perspective, if I'm understanding MacIntyre right, that still doesn't solve the sort of fundamental problem, that you're still taking your conception of the good to be pretty fixed. The question is, as it were, at the end, when it comes to the world, there's more sort of messiness and contingency there, which of course Hegel always allows. And so taking that into account, to some extent, a sort of constant updating and is going to be required. But you haven't really, I guess, as I'm conceiving it, and I may be totally wrong, but from MacIntyre's perspective, you still haven't grasped the nettle, which is that the whole picture needs rethinking. And so the dynamism that you've injected isn't really of the right kind, I guess, is what MacIntyre might say. If I'm getting MacIntyre right at all, which, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, Kelvin Knight.
All right. Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, Robert, thanks for that. There's a lot of, I think Alistair denies pretty consistently that he is any kind of perfectionist at all, certainly not a post-Kantian one, but not even an Aristotelian one. Yeah, I mean, I think he's disabused me of that pretty forcefully long ago. So yeah, in his eyes, I share the error there. So as you put it, I think non-perfectionism, not making the perfect the enemy of the good, is very much inbuilt in his position. Yeah.
But that's not what I'm meaning by perfectionism.
Right.
Obviously.
Could I, but okay, look,
I mean, it's not about let's make a perfect world or
no, fine. But look, I think ever since 1988, Terry Irwin and Alistair, who, and I've got immense respect for both of them, right? But they are very different. They've both written Thomistic histories of ethics, yeah? They're both Thomistic Aristotelians, let's say, but they are very different sorts of Aristotelian. I mean, Terry certainly is a perfectionist, yeah? And his whole history of the development of ethics, yeah, this is the one with the Hegel in.
Yeah, but Kelvin, I mean, Terry is a pre-Kantian perfectionist.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. Of course he is. And look,
MacIntyre is a post-Kantian one. So
yeah,
of course they're pretty different.
Yeah, look, they're different fundamentally, both methodologically and substantively, right? I mean, look,
But if you use the word "a good life for man," you're a perfectionist in my book.
Yeah, but look, let me look. Really, Terry and Alistair totally opposed methodologically, right? I mean, the conclusion of this is Hegelian, right? I mean, that was his big word on Aristotle. Yeah, Aristotle's first principles, right? I mean, he quotes Green and he says that you know, ethics is the freedom of perfect understanding of the world as rational, is what he concludes the book on. Yeah, so a Hegelian come Thomist history,
Kevin,
right?
that's exactly what I've been saying in the paper, right? There's a Hegelian form of perfectionism that MacIntyre is against. The question is, does that make him a non or anti-perfectionist, or just a different kind of perfectionist? And insofar as there's the good life for man is the life spent searching for the good life for man, that still is a form of perfectionism, because you're still talking about the good life for man. It's very radical, and as I tried to explain, un-Hegelian. Therefore, an Hegelian like Terry Irwin will not agree with it. But they're still battling over perfectionism. They're not. Yeah. They're not doing a completely different subject.
if I, well, let's see. Okay, yep, I think I'll agree with all that, but well, except that you start, so I'm afraid I couldn't leave this one with by saying that they are both post-Kantian perfectionists, and so I think Robert Pippin's entirely right. Yeah, that well, Alistair is at most a very insubstantive non-perfectionist, and as I say, as you put it, I'd suggest that he is an inbuilt anti-perfectionist, which surprised me as well. Yeah, but yeah, look, I mean, there's been this dialogue going on, right? I mean, I think the development of ethics is pretty obviously a very extended, very important response to Alistair's, what Terry Irwin ironically calls historicist errors. Yeah. And in a couple of years later, in 3 rival versions of Moral Inquiry, I mean, it may be that to some extent is Alistair's response to Irwin, because he has a go at the Louvain neo-Thomists about Kant, right? But you know, he criticizes Thomists who turn Aquinas into a corrector of Kant, and that's exactly what Irwin is doing in his history.
Right. Well, exactly. So that makes Irwin a pre-Kantian perfectionist, and
yes, and not
MacIntyre
post-Kantian
sorry
perfectionist. Then, which perhaps I misread it, but no, your first line, both of them are post-Kantian perfectionists.
Oh, yeah.
So okay, we'll agree a pre-Kantian perfectionist versus yeah, right, okay.
Good, then we can agree, I think.
Okay, Matthias Hase.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Robert. I wanted to ask you about what you explicitly set aside, namely that MacIntyre in Dependent Rational Animals carries out the project that he announces as the need for a metaphysical foundation that he thought is lacking in After Virtue. And I thought, my understanding is that the need for pointing to a metaphysical foundation is providing an argument for the telos of human beings that cannot be gotten out of immanent critique. And so I'm thinking that in his development, he sees the need for a determinacy that you've been arguing for we don't need. And so I was wondering how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, well, he changes his mind, right, as happens. And as we know, he goes through various changes of mind for various reasons. The question is, again, I suppose, whether he's right to have changed his mind. I mean, personally, I'm happy with the MacIntyre of dependent rational animals. I mean, that fits with other views that I have personally. So I'm happy enough with it. But I just wanted to and yeah, in a way, there is a bit more politics, I suppose, or social philosophy in that book than the earlier books and so on, which again, people might prefer. I think he just becomes more optimistic about what one can say about the good in later work, is my understanding of it. So he feels able to be more sort of positive about it. I don't know. Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting question whether the change of mind represents a sort of serious argument against the earlier position as being problematic. I'm not sure. I mean, I'd have to think about that. I mean, in that way, if you take the later MacIntyre, then yeah, I mean, he would be closer to I suppose, a broadly Hegelian view, but with an emphasis more on our dependence as creatures and the kind of state that we need for that and so So that would make the contrast less interesting, which is, I guess, why I didn't focus on it. Is that, yeah, does that help? I mean,
Yes.
do you think that there's an important argument that gets you from, as it were, the early to the late MacIntyre? The early MacIntyre is unstable, and therefore you have to move to the late MacIntyre.
Well, I was thinking there is a worry related to the one you brought up and tried to argue against, that I thought the way you presented it, it looks like the virtues are introduced, virtues like truthfulness are introduced as means for the possibility of the quest, which can seem to leave open that what we might find out in the course of the quest is that the best for us would be to live in a way that, for instance, might involve half of the people serving the other half, because there's no direct, there's no link between the nature of the quest and the substantial conception of the good. We just need the virtues in order to engage in the quest.
Right.
But what actually might be discovered in the course of the quest may be contrary. And I
Right.
thought the later tries to fix that issue.
Right. Well, in a way, I mean, there is a way in which I think I am going slightly beyond MacIntyre, even in what I presented here, which is this idea that the good itself is dynamic. So I think there's a danger both in MacIntyre and in Brewer that the dynamism is just epistemic. So we don't quite know what the good is, and we need to take some time. It's not that we know that, it's not like the mind and we know the good, we need to just find it somewhere. We are trying to discover the good, but that's the only reason we need the dynamism. We haven't quite sussed it yet. But the hope is we get to understanding it, and then, as it were, the quest will be over. What I was calling a dynamic good makes the dynamism even more fundamental. So again, using the analogy with a relationship, it's not like in a relationship, well, we don't know what our great marriage will be yet when we start, but give us 30 years and we'll sort it out, hopefully, and it will turn out to involve X. There is no such point. That itself is a mistake. And so in that sense, the dynamism is sort of endless, which is why I raised Robert's worry that it's Sisyphean, because, well, why would you go on for this? So that's how I'm thinking about it. And I think that might actually be slightly beyond both MacIntyre and Brewer. But that might head off your worry, right? Because it's not like at the end of this quest, we are going to suss it. And it turns out, oh dear. Yeah, do you see what I mean?
Yes, that's helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take Jan and then Douglas Mogash. Jan Candiali, please.
Hi, Bob. Good to see you. So very briefly, I thought there might be another Hegelian reply. So the other Hegelian reply would be, we want a conception of the good life which is compatible with other people having a conception of the good life, or compatible with other people's conception of the good life. And as Robert Pippin was saying earlier, Hegel's got a kind of painstaking account of how my good within the rational state can be compatible with other people's good. And it's not clear that the MacIntyrean account would work on a kind of society-wide level. If we had a society of people like Travis, you might just worry that everybody in kind of search of their quest, it's just not going to be a kind of stable conception of society. So I wondered if there's that type of Hegelian reply as well.
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, so I suppose I'm not sure if you're asking a sort of practical problem, like, we're all okay, so we're all off sort of questing our conception of the good. How do we then unify these various quests? And I'm not sure, I'm not seeing why that should be a major issue necessarily. I mean, because after all, one of the problems with conceptions of the good becoming competing is the dogmatism involved, crudely, right? And that just wouldn't be part of this picture. So some of those tensions are resolvable. And putting it on the other side, I don't think Hegel's himself trying to solve the problem that you're presenting. His problem is, how do we unify these two perspectives of individuality and particularity, not how do we unify a state where people have radically different conceptions of the good. Because he doesn't think there are radically different conceptions of the good. I mean, the good is freedom. Freedom has this structure, and that's what we're all signed up for. That's what I meant when I briefly said, I mean, I think ironically, MacIntyre thinks Hegel's trying to solve the problem you've suggested. But I don't think Hegel is trying to solve that at all, because he knows what the good is. And, you know, we've got there after, you know, centuries of history, but it's now pretty clear what it is, just a question of how to implement it. So I don't think Hegel's solving your problem. And MacIntyre might solve your problem simply because of the sort of fallibilism built into the questing model. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I didn't take Hegel to be attempting to solve that problem, so I think I agree with you. I agree with you that for Hegel, in a way, we all have the same conception of the good. It can be realized in multiple different ways within the structures of the rational state. But he is trying to show, especially I think in the section on civil society, how that can kind of cohere together in an organized system and make a kind of stable view of society.
Yeah.
I was thinking just that if you were kind of questing and trying out different things, that it doesn't look so stable in the MacIntyrean form. So think of people like Travis, right? It does seem to have this kind of practical problem that if you had a lot of people like that, I mean, think of it within an academic department. If you had a lot of people like Travis, you might wish you had a few more people like his brother, just to make things run in a bit of a smoother fashion, right? So
yeah, I mean, fair enough. I mean, I agree that how this then gets spelled out into as Robert was asking, a sort of substantive political structure. But, you know, after all, yeah, okay, fair enough. I mean, I don't have a MacIntyrean political philosophy to offer you. I mean, Travis is obviously a pretty extreme example, and he starts his quest from not zero, as I was saying, but from a long way back. I mean, and most of us aren't quite in that position, I suppose, for one reason or another. So maybe things wouldn't be quite as bad as you're fearing if we're all a bit further along in some sense in our quest.
Okay, Douglas Mogat.
Yes, thanks very much, Bob. That was really interesting. I'm just wondering whether your presentation of Hegel as having such fixity of final end doesn't risk turning him into a pre-Kantian perfectionist, where I take one of the attributes of that to be a metaphysically derivable definition of a good life, right, to which other aspects must conform.
Right. I mean, good. And I should, again, acknowledge Doug here as the source of this wonderful word term post-Kantian perfectionism, which I find very helpful. Well, okay, so I think Hegel is post-Kantian in lots of ways, which I won't bore on about.
No, I do too.
But one is relevant to your question there. I mean, again, it's the move from, this is a bit crude, but Aristotelian biologism to the will, to freedom, right? So there is a conception of flourishing, but it's not based on our nature as animals and all the rest of it, but it's based on the structure of the will, freedom, etc. So that's how you get the Kantian sort of centrality of notions of autonomy and freedom built into the very nature of perfectionism. And actually, sorry, I've forgotten who, but somebody asked about the later MacIntyre, the move to dependent rational animals. I mean, that's a way in which MacIntyre isn't quite going back to biologism, but is going back to, again, our nature in a less post-Kantian way, maybe rightly. I mean, as I say, I've got actually personally quite a lot of sympathy for the dependent rational animals position, but that would be my answer to why Hegel's post-Kantian. It's freedom and the structure of the will rather than, our nature as the kinds of animals we are, etc. Does that
right? Of course, no, I totally agree with that. But I think that also has implications for the way that the final end can be understood as well.
Right.
Which must be understood in light of this centrality of freedom in a much less pre-established.
Right, but I mean, this is the thing that seems to me, I mean, again, other Hegelians may not like me for it, but this is where the structure of the logic gives Hegel a sense of the structure of what freedom is. And so again, it's not coming from biology or whatever, but it's coming from, well, however you think Hegel's logic is meant to work.
The nature of thought. Yeah.
Yeah, so you get a kind of determinacy to the story that way, that then seems to me to make this difference with MacIntyre fundamentally. So again, it's not Aristotelian in a more naturalistic, biologistic sense.
Right, right. Okay, no, I think we're certainly in agreement about that, but I question your reading of Hegel as having such a determinate endpoint, I guess.
That's option one, as it were, on the options I gave.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm still in option one there. Okay.
Yeah, and that's what most Hegelians have said to me. But then one response is, well, okay, we could talk about the role of the logic. But secondly, if that's right, and there's more dynamism, then Hegel needs to expand his menu of virtues beyond rectitude. Because rectitude only works as a virtue if you've got a pretty determinate structure, pretty clear rules to follow. So something has to give in Hegel's story, and that's fine. I mean, as I say, at the end of the day, if we have agreement about Hegel, I'm happy with that. But I think you can't just, something has to give.
Okay, we'll pursue this another time. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we're at the end of question, running a little bit over. So let's thank Professor Robert Stern of University of Sheffield.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the discussion and the questions.